When my daddy left the country, the only choice he had was to go to a cotton mill, and it broke his heart. He couldn't bear the thoughts of it because he didn't like the thoughts of us being raised at a cotton mill village. He loved the farm, he loved the land, and he wanted to raise his family there because he had been always made a good living. We'd always had a good life in the country, and when he seen there was no other choice, he told me that I could go to work. I could come to East Union and see if I could get a job. I had some relatives there. So I got on the train. We had a little train. It was called the Dugan, and it ran between Carrollton and Union and went on down to Raymond. So I got on the Dugan, and I came to East Union, and I applied for a job, and they gave me a job. I came on Sunday, and I went to work on Monday. And my daddy didn't have a job right then. He knew he had the promise of a job, and I worked for about 2 weeks before he went to work, and he was heartbroken. It hurt his pride to, if you love your work, what you've always been accustomed to, and have to leave it. It was like leaving, I guess, an old friend. I'll say it was like leaving an old friend, because he dearly loved the land, and he always made good crops. He worked hard, and anybody would tell you that he raised good crops as good as anybody around. He took care of his livestock. He took care of his animals and the wagons and everything that around the farm. And so when we had to leave, he had to leave all of that because, you see, you couldn't keep the cows and things. You could keep a cow too, but you couldn't keep mules and horses and pigs and such as that right then. But later on, they did let us build some houses off in the pasture, and he got his own cow, and he got a pig, and so he raised some hogs, and he raised a cow. But it wasn't anything to compare with what he had in the country. See, when we lived in the country, he'd have huge barns of corn, and he'd have fodder, and he'd have hay, and just all kind of things like that piled up. See, we had it in reserve. We didn't have to worry about tomorrow. But when you live at the mill, you always have a feeling, if I don't do like they say, I'm out of here. So it was quite different from being your own boss and having a boss over you. And he had never had that, you see. So it was heartbreaking for him. And he always, till the day he died, he loved the country. But he died at East Point, Georgia. I had a brother that worked up there, and my daddy had done got old, and we wasn't able to go back to work then. And so he lived at East Point when he died. But
I'm curious, he's obviously a man who had a lot of get up and go about.
He was, everybody would say, even when he worked in the mill, they said Tom Wilson did more work than any one man they'd ever seen. And I'm not boasting, I'm telling it like it was. He was a hard worker because he was raised that way.
I just wondered then, why did they pick him up and make him a supervisor?
They had their own, when he went there, you see, they had their own ones, and they never changed. Now, my husband at one time, they wanted him to be a supervisor, and they told him what he would be called if he was a supervisor. He said, I'll just keep the job I've got.
What would have you been called?
A bad word. When anybody got mad at him, you see. If he said something to him, they wanted to tell him off, well, he'd had took it. Or fired on one.
That's a rough place to have to be, a small boss like that.
Yeah, but it's so different now. Now, I didn't work, after West Point Pepperell came here. They was Mount Vernon Mills came here, and then one other after East Union went out. But they were modernized, had pretty hardwood floors and pretty fixtures, and it was just real nice, so different from what it had been. But anyway, we all lived through it, and it's fun to go back and think about it. And I can say that I came up the hard way, but I enjoyed it. But I did have, I had good opportunities later on in life, and I wound up working in a florist right over here on Greenville Street. That was my last job.
Was it hard for you to see your dad work inside?
Mm-hmm. Real hard, because I knew his heart wasn't in it. He gave his all to it, but I knew that his mind was in the country. He had his mind on the country, but he gave his all in the cotton mill.
Did you know a man named Zimmerman?
My husband did. I didn't. They were from Hogansville. They had moved from East Union to Hogansville. But we have a reunion. We have the Hogansville and East Union reunion once a year, and the Zimmerman girls were there this year. But see, my husband knew those people because he was raised there. And see, I was raised on the farm until we had to go to the cotton mill.
Now, we have some newsreel footage, and I wonder if you'd mind taking a look at that to see if you can identify some people.
All right.
Taken in 1934.
All right.
Okay?
All right.
Okay, so we'll have to break a few minutes to
Yeah,
get it
all right.
started. Okay?
Specifically, those arrested are charged with attempting to prevent the reopening of the Noonan Mills. Reminiscent of World War days is the hastily constructed internment camp in which the strikers are confined. This one is in back of Fort McPherson at Atlanta.
I remember
Armed
that
guards
now.
patrol the barbed wire enclosure surrounding the camp while the prisoners learn how it feels to be on the inside looking out. Chow time finds a lot of healthy appetites, and the incarcerated ladies make the best of their predicament. It's good old army grub, plain but nourishing, and the state is paying for it.
I wish I could recognize some of them, but I don't think any of them were from East Union. I don't believe they were.
Now, these are just some scenes repeated.
Mm-hmm.
Cut off the sound.
That's National Guard, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And so you can see, we'll just run the rest of this silent, and you may be able to recognize some of the people. Maybe you may recognize some of the buildings.
I might have been in that crowd. I don't see a church, so we were standing right near the church. It's familiar looking, but I don't know any of them. I can't recognize any of them. But it brings back a lot of memories. I wish that man who had the stick would be on. Police putting him in the car, wasn't they? Was that made at Union Cotton Mill? I was going to say that might have been down at the bridge, because that was a crowd of people there, and there were trees across the street from it. But see, those people on the trucks had came from other places there.
remember what Governor Talmadge said about this?
I will when you repeat it, I guess, but I can't think right now. I remember when he'd come to Newnan, everybody was so crazy about Talmadge. Him up there and them a hollering and a hooping and a carrying on. Now I imagine that's sort of like the little place where they were down below the mill, the ones that had the sticks guarding the mill, you know. That looks kind of like something they would have had. I don't know if that's it or not. But that fence must be up at Fort Mac, is it? Having a beauty stroke, wasn't it? Do you think that was some of it they carried into the... Lord, yeah, those old long dresses is hot in the mill. That big fat one looked like me. I wasn't in it, though.
That was Maud Granger.
Who?
Maud Granger.
Maud Granger. Oh, you know some of the people then. I mean, you know the faces.
I just know the name.
That's what I mean. I mean, you recognize them on here. Where was she from? Hogansville, probably.
Do you know why the people at Hogansville were so strong for the Union when the people at East Newnan were not?
Mm-mm. I know they were making more money all the time than the people at East Newnan always did. By the way, I had a friend buried just about 6 or 8 weeks ago that had that, call it black lung, you know, from running that asbestos. That's why my husband knew the Zimmermans. See, they left East Newnan and went to Hogansville, and they did make more money there. But they would say about the East Newnan people, they had to have that East Newnan water. If they left, they'd have to come back. How long did they stay up there?
About a week.
I wish I could, but if most of them was from Hogansville, I'm sure, 'cause I don't remember of any of them from East Newnan being. Now that's plain. You know those? I just don't know any of them. Don't recognize them, probably, should say. I'd forgot about them feeding them like that. They didn't do that down while they was down the mill, though. That's why I didn't know them. I remember something, they called that the pen, didn't they?
That's all the footage we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wish I could have recognized some of them, but I didn't know too many people from Hogansville. Mm-hmm. Now, the Zimmerman, see, I just got to know them after they started having the Eastern Union and Hogansville reunion. My husband knew a lot of people at Hogansville, but I didn't.
Okay, one other thing, Jamie, just want to go back to the other, we'll put off this television set then. Boy, you got a good set here.
It's old.
But
I've had it 15 years. I don't know how old
it
it
showed up well on that set. Is back to something that we talked about before, and just wanted to see if you could tell us once again about it. And that is the way this union and non-union split families and neighborhoods. So could you tell us about that again?
Well, there was a little confusion down there because some of the families were for the union and others were against it. And naturally it got down to the children, you know, and you know how children will argue about things. The children seemed to be more concerned than the grown-ups were about because they were frightened anyway. But neighbors they kind of felt hard at each other. The ones that belonged to the union held a grudge against the one that didn't join. But a lot of them, as I say a while ago, a lot of them didn't know which side you were on until it came to the showdown, you know. And so it was, they stayed that way for a while, but then when they all went back to work, everybody was a little shamefaced. I remember that. Everybody was looked a little down, you know, because they had come to the end of the rope and they knew that was it. And so it wasn't too long, not many, I guess maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and everything was back to normal. So they just, there wasn't any hard feelings carried over for a period of time. It was just for a while that they were kind of upset with each other.
Now, we went up to the library and went through the local papers.
Uh-huh.
And the local papers were absolutely dead set against the strike and the unions right from the beginning.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Well, what I can remember, see, I wasn't in the, if I would have been working then, I would have known more about it, but see, I was out because I was expecting a baby then. But I know that they would be afraid in the mill, like I heard the ones that were in the mill working, you know. They would, maybe they would think a boss man's suspicion of belonging to it, and they'd go around and question somebody else. And you know how some people will tell on others. I do know that went on. There were a few people that would tell who belonged to the union and who didn't, which they wasn't supposed to do, you know. You were supposed to just keep it secret. But they were some of them that would tell. I remember that. And I don't know, I can't remember I don't remember anything fierce happening, but I do remember that the ones that wanted it were dead. They were dead set for it, and the ones that didn't want it were dead set against it. So it was just a conflict. Just that's the way it was. But after it was settled, it wasn't long till they were back to normal. But it would have been the best thing in the world if they'd got it across. After so many years, I wasn't for it. I couldn't see it. But now, since I've seen, in recent years, what the union stands for is good. Sometimes it's misused, but I think what it stands for is really good.
Why do you think it didn't work then?
Because they would have had to pay the more wages. They would have had to pay you what you was worth. I guess that's about the simplest way I know how to put it, and about the most truthful way. They would have had to pay you a decent wage.
Well, what kept the union from succeeding?
I think it was I think it was the ones that owned it. Now that's where I would think it come in, because I think they had more thought. They had more authority. People frightened, afraid they'd lose a job. A lot of them would have, if it hadn't been for knowing that they wouldn't have, thinking maybe they might not have a job. Probably 9 out of 10 of them would have joined. That's the thing. But they just knew that, see, there wasn't too much work going on then, and if you got out of a job, there was nothing else to go to. So that was, like you said, it was either stay there or go down. So that's just about the gist of what I remember about that.
Judy, you had one other question.
Oh yeah, you told me your husband, who wasn't your husband at the time. No, your husband was working at the mill.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What were his choices?
He wasn't for it. He wasn't for the union.
Could you say my husband wasn't for
My husband was not for the union, and I think maybe one reason because he didn't know any more about the reality of a union. He didn't know what it would meant to him, and another thing because he was still young, you see, and he leaned towards his father, and of course my family, my father, and they leaned toward the older men, and that kept a lot of the younger men from expressing their opinion, from really knowing what it was about. And he knew too, he was like a lot of others, he knew that if he lost his job, he'd had 2 little boys and a wife that he wouldn't have no way of keeping them up. And he didn't know what he would if he joined the union, but what he would lose his job. But he was strictly against it for that reason. But if he had known the ramifications of what it could have led to, and it could have gone through, he would have been for it. In later years, when he was expressing his opinion, he'd say that was the best thing, a union was the best thing in the world that could happen. But he said a lot of times people would misuse what they do in everything else. Nothing's perfect. But sometimes they'd take advantage of it. But he was strictly against it. But if he had just been single, with no family, I don't know, he might have been for the union then. But he was expecting another child and already had 2. And so he didn't have much choice.
Wasn't there education at the time? Weren't there people explaining to workers what the union was about?
It was so secretive till you didn't get a chance to hear it explained very often. It was kept undercover, honey. In the mill, you couldn't talk it. You were afraid to talk it. You were afraid to discuss it because you were afraid you'd lose your job. They really didn't know what it was all about, I don't think. I don't really think that the common working man really knew what the union, the good it would have been for them. Of course, the overseer, I'm sure that the personnel, I'm sure that the owners knew what they were doing, But if times had been better, if it hadn't been during the Depression, maybe more people then would have acted different, But they, just as I said, they didn't know, there wasn't any place to go. There just wasn't any jobs to be found.
One of the interesting things to me is that while the South with textiles went all in this direction with no union, the rest of the country was going in the other direction with, steel and automobiles and all of that. And one of the things we're doing in this film is just try to examine why.
Well, the only reason that I can get is because of the way they had to pay more wages. They had it like they wanted it. So to speak, we was bowed down to it. And the North has always made better living than people, had better wages, better places to live. Well, I don't know now whether better places or not, but I know long back then they did. Things we'd hear, it would seem unreal to us, about the people up north, what they had. That's why I told you the other day, you just didn't know what you'd miss not living in the South.
Well, since there was such a big, times were so difficult, could you just tell me a little bit about, think about the character of those people that did go out on strike?
They were fine people. I can't say a thing.
Character's the wrong word. I mean, they were taking a risk.
Oh yes.
Can you talk about that risk?
They were taking a risk of losing if their overseer could find out that they were for the Union. If he wanted to, he could find some excuse probably to have got shut of them. He wouldn't have had to say. If they'd have just made a mistake, maybe he could have. I don't know that happened, but that's the way I had it and the way I look at it now. Any little thing that come up, if they knew you belonged to the Union, you were on a blacklist, so to speak. I forgot. I like to touch it.
Now, what about those people on the picket line? They made it public, didn't they?
Not until they had to. When they did? It's when all those others came down in those trucks you seen going through. And that's when, that's when we found out actually who all were for the Union. We knew a lot of them, but we didn't know a lot. We didn't know some of them that were for the Union.
Then, Judy, you see, this explains why you needed the flying squad.
Yeah. Could you tell me about the night that the people in the trucks came?
It was day.
Okay, tell me about the day, and tell me about, and use that phrase, people in the trucks, so I know, so other people aside from me will know.
Well, I can remember the day very well because it was a real hot day, and I was at my mother's house, and we had heard that they were on the way through East Union, and people began to gather down around the church, down kind of in the center of the village, and everybody was hollering and carrying on, and when they came through, it was just a big rabble-rouse, just people hollering, and I think the ones that belonged to the Union probably must have thought that they were going to win, and the others that were hollering thought, no, you won't win, we're going to win. So I think it was just a toss-up between the two. But there wasn't any, I don't remember any fights or anything like that, but there was a lot of hard feelings.
It must have taken a lot of guts to do that.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. I'm sure it did.
Particularly these young women.
Yes,
It's one of the reasons we're looking to try to find some of them and find out just how they felt.
I wish that I knew. Have you been to Hogansville? Did any of them recognize them? Well, I can't recognize any of them. I really didn't know them. I know I've met the Zimmermans in the last